Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. One of the things that everyone was interested in from my 2026 WSOP recap video was talking about the differences between the level of play and the style of play in $1,500 events versus their 10K equivalent. And I was thinking today while I was looking through some notes about the early events that I played, which is the 1500 the Omaha 8 or Better tournament, versus the 10K Omaha 8 or Better tournament. And it led me to want to discuss a general concept and a big difference that I saw between those two events. But honestly, this also applies to really any 1500 versus 10K equivalent, and also to small mid-stakes cash games versus higher stakes cash games. And the theme is relatively similar. In these smaller events and in these smaller games, I can't tell you guys how often I would see a very strong holding pre-flop that took a passive action. So in the '08 tournaments, that was specifically hands like aces, ace deuce, combos, and even good solver hands that sometimes humans underrate, such as a hand like ace 4 jack king with a nut suit. These are all hands that the solver would be perfectly happy putting in piles of money pre-flop, heads up or multi-way, and yet in the 1500 '08, I would routinely see these hands be limped, cold called, or just flat called out of the big blind. Even sometimes in blind battles where you really would think you only have one opponent and would have a huge equity edge. So thinking about this made me really wonder why that is. And I think that there's two main reasons why smaller stakes players are underplaying these sort of hands and not putting in the right aggression level pre-flop with good hands. The first is simply not knowing the equities, right? Some of these are obvious. When you have a premium hand like ace 3, I think even a small stakes player knows that he should be an equity favorite against his opponents. But there is a bit of a preconceived notion, particularly maybe in Omaha 8 or Better, that the hands just run close to each other pre, and you're not really pushing a lot of equity, and it's not that big of a deal. This is problematic for a couple reasons. It causes you to want to play more passively and play smaller pots because you perceive that you'll be able to push a larger equity edge later in the hand. In fact, I think I would go so far as to say that loosely the way my opponents are playing in some of these smaller events, and the way maybe you're playing in some of these smaller events, is you really just want to make your hand before putting any money in. And so if you take that to its logical extreme, what you would see is people not wanting really to put any money in until the river when they can see whether or not they have the best hand, and then putting all the money in. But here's the problem. Your opponents are also thinking about this, right? And so if you get to the river and you now make the nuts and you want to put all the money in, now this is a situation where your opponent does not want any more money to go into the pot. So you don't get that opportunity unless your opponent is completely brain dead. You have to be more comfortable putting in money with an equity edge early in the hand, knowing that you're maybe pushing a smaller edge, but there's still an edge to be pushed. I think that if you polled a lot of the small stakes players, especially ones in the 1500 events, and you said, hey, you've got 55% pre-flop here in this spot heads up, you're in a 55-45, what do you want to do? They would say, well, I'll just call. Maybe later in the hand, I'll be in an 80-20 situation. And that is fundamentally a misunderstanding of how poker works, especially how limit poker works. You really want to bash people over the head with your equity advantage in limit poker. The idea is you push an equity edge in all situations, and then you figure out where your bluffs come from when your range has that equity advantage. This is something the higher stakes players are much better at, just knowing that they're putting in money with the best hand or the best range, and not being particularly worried about the variance involved when they only have a small equity edge in those situations. That kind of brings me to the second reason why I think smaller stakes players make these mistakes, especially in Omaha 8 or Better, is because they're just kind of trying to avoid gambling. They're afraid that they're going to play too big of a pot with a medium strength hand, they're going to lose, and then they're going to be knocked out of the tournament. I've got other videos on my channel that sort of talk about this concept, but you can't win a poker tournament by being afraid to run out of chips in a poker tournament, especially early on. Your job is to push equity advantages and try to build up a stack so that later in the tournament, when the ICM pressure starts to kick in, you'll be in a position to take advantage of that and be able to play even more hands and take more advantage of your opponents than you will in the early stages of the tournament, where you're simply trying to play chip EV, where you're certainly trying to just put in money with the best hand and make EV. So the players that are more willing to push small edges early on often are the ones that end up being the big chip leaders later on and have the ability to potentially win the tournament. And then finally, I also think that there's a bit of a mindset in smaller stakes where people feel good about tricking their opponent or trapping their opponents and surprising them with a strong hand that they don't believe that they can have. And this kind of, again, is just a bit of a misconception, especially about how limit poker works. You really want to err on the side of aggression, and you want to fool your opponents with aggression. What that means is you don't miss bets with any of your good hands, and then you have enough weak hands that are also taking an aggressive action at times. So just upping aggression across the board and understanding where your edge is coming from and being willing to push a smaller equity edge. This is the main difference I see between the 1500 level of play and the 10K level of play, and I think that particularly rears its head in Omaha 8 or better. You see people routinely underplaying aces, underplaying ace-deuce combos, underplaying all sorts of hands pre-flop, not necessarily knowing the equity advantage that they have with certain hands, but also maybe just not being comfortable pushing that equity advantage. One final thought on that subject, a very, very strong player also understands that you can jam the hand profitably pre, and then reevaluate on those bad flop textures, reevaluate later in the hand. You're not just making one decision and then getting to showdown and just being done with the hand. There's still poker to be played and there's still decisions to be made, but you want to start out trying to put in money with the best hand and the best range, and then reevaluate when things get dicey and being willing to navigate through those tricky situations that you create for yourself. I think that is where the biggest edge comes from in these games. Let me know if that's you, what questions this raises for you, how I can help to make these concepts more clear, and we'll just continue talking about some of these differences that I noticed, but this is one I really wanted to pay attention to first as I review some of my hands from the Omaha 8 or better tournaments early on in the WSOP 2026. So see you guys in the comments and look forward to more. Thanks.